Hello and welcome once again. So I'm back with you for my ASP.NET Core 3.1 playlist, and today I'm going to discuss about model binding in ASP.NET Core 3.1. So in this tutorial today, I shall be covering what is model binding and the basics with some code snippets. So controllers and razor pages work with data that comes from HTTP requests. Okay. So when I say controllers, it includes the MVC controllers as well as Web API controllers. And model binding automates this process. The model binding system retrieves data from various sources such as route data, form fields, and query strings, and provides the data to controllers and razor pages in method parameters and public properties. It also further converts string data to .NET types and updates properties of complex types. And the term model binding refers to the feature of ASP.NET Core controllers and razor pages that allows us to map request information to named parameters in action methods or page handler methods. Action methods in controllers and page handler methods in razor pages. Okay. And every single request that hits the server in an ASP.NET Core application is served with a response by executing an action, namely a public method or a controller or page model class. Okay, so where does this data at all comes from in the HTTP requests? We have briefly seen that it comes from several sources. Now here are them in more explanation in slightly detailed mode. So route data is one of the sources which may provide a record key and posted form fields which may provide values for the model properties. And request body, of course, for controllers that have the API controller attribute and query string parameters. Now, before I move and finally from the uploaded files, I would request you to go through the entire video to understand the gist of the model binding, and later on we will switch over to Visual Studio to analyze a bit of a code, and in the next lecture I will be further doing coding on the Visual Studio. Right, so now here is a code snippet from a action result type on the pet class, which is get by ID. And here we have got a URL which is like this: local https://localhost: port number, my local port number, which will differ in your version in your machines, /API/pets/1 $dogs only equals true. Now, given this action method and this request URL, now a few things can be observed. First of all, let's see the steps performed by the model binding in the previous code. Once assuming that the routing system has selected the action or the page handler method, action method in a MVC or web API, and a page handler method in razor pages. Now it first looks into the parameter in the get by ID action method, which is an ID that is of integer type. And then it looks through the request and finds the ID in the route data. Okay, ID equals 1 in the route data, and it converts the string 1 in the request to integer 1. It then looks into the second parameter in the get by ID action method, which is a boolean dogs only, and it looks through the request and finds a term dogs only whose value is true. And because this engine does not it doesn't take into account, this is case insensitive, so dogs only, which has got a value of true in a query string, will be equated to the dogs only in the get by ID method parameter. Okay, so next it converts the string true to the boolean true. And finally, the framework accesses the get by ID method and passes 1 for ID as the first and true for dogs only as the second parameter. And again, so we have got this request. If you look into the these callouts, you will find again, given this request and this code, again we'll see that it looks into the first parameter in the get by ID action, which is an ID of int type, and it looks through the request, which is this, and finds ID equals 1 in the route data, and it converts this is a string because URL is always a string, and it converts the string 1 in the request to integer 1. That's automatically done by the model binding engine. And then it looks into the second parameter of the getById action method, which is a boolean. It's declared as boolean type dogs only, and then it looks through this incoming request and it finds the dogs only word whose value is true in the query string, and this is then mapped to the boolean dogs only, this dogs only, because this is case insensitive, and it then converts the string, this is the string, true to the boolean true, and then the framework accesses the getById method and passes 1 for ID as the first and true for dogs only as second parameter, and that's in a nutshell how it works. Okay, now let's switch over to the Visual Studio and do it. I mean, I have got the code already in action, and see what I'm telling, okay, by sending a request like this. So over to Visual Studio. Now over to the Visual Studio. Now how I created this solution and this project model binding validation, it is from Microsoft documentation GitHub source, but I will tell you in the next lecture how I created this project and got the code from the Microsoft repository. Okay, so let's run this application by clicking this IIS Express button. So you have got this model binding validation application. Now let me browse to this URL that I have explained to you. So you have got this response back, ID equals 1, breed equals Kohli, name equals Fido, and pet type equals 0. So where does it come from? Let's see in a nutshell, and switching over to Visual Studio again. So here, pets in memory store, it comes from this pets in memory store, which is a static list. Okay, so static list of pets in memory store. So let's go to pets in memory store, click on go to definition. Okay, so you have got this new pet, breed equals Kohli, ID equals 1, name equals Fido, and pet type equals pet type dot dog. Okay, so how does it work in a nutshell? What happens is that var pet is a variable, it is assigned its value dynamically in compile time. So pets in memory store dot first or default, so the first value or the default value, if there is no first value in that memory store, it is operated upon with this predicate. P goes to, this is lambda expression, so p dot id, so id is passed from here, getById first parameter, through the model binding engine, and if it is equal to the id, so pets in memory store dot id is equal to the passed in id, and this condition is also satisfied, so not dogs only or p dot pet type equals pet type dot dog. So this, both these conditions are satisfied, so you get a variable pet, and then it returns the pet, okay, from the pets in memory store, which is a in-memory collection. Right, this is how it works. So in this lecture today, we have seen what is model binding and a bit of coding example and how it works in the actual practice.